so I'm Daniela. I am the founder of Kids Up Reading Coaches. We're a tutoring company that specializes in teaching kids to read and spell. Kids with dyslexia and dysgraphia, kids without dyslexia and dysgraphia. It's basically all about the reading and the spelling. Just as a little bit of background, I was a lawyer in DC actually for about 25 years. And then I decided I was done with that whole lawyering thing, and I went back to school. I got a master's degree in special ed. I did a whole bunch of training, specialized training for how to teach dyslexic kids to read and spell, and then started this tutoring company. We are now 21 tutors working with about 50 kids these days. 54, I think, is the exact number as of this morning. So that's just a little bit of background on me. And it looks like we've got 3 folks here, so it's a small crowd. You guys are welcome to interrupt, to ask questions, either during the presentation or at the end. We should have plenty of time to answer everybody's questions and talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. Here we go. Okay, so this is just a little warm up to kind of get us all going and thinking about all of these things. Everyone, what are the long vowel sounds? So I know you guys are all on mute. You can unmute yourselves, or you can just, stay hidden and quiet or just say it out loud to yourselves. I won't be able to hear it, but just go ahead and do it. What are the long vowel sounds in English? Everyone's staying on mute. Okay, so the long vowel sounds in English are A, E, I, O, and U. Next one, what are the short vowel sounds in English? That is A, E, I, A. And it's really important for kids to be able to recite those things just like that. Long vowel sounds, short vowel sounds. It's good for reading, but it's really also good for spelling because we have a lot of special spelling patterns in English that apply only if a particular sound is right after a short vowel sound. So the floss rule, if you remember that, double F, double L, double S, double Z, CK, TCH, DGE, those are 7 special spelling patterns that we only use right after a short vowel sound. So back would be with a CK and bake would just have the K. Okay, onward. How many sounds, so we're back to our warm-up now. How many sounds, not how many letters, how many sounds are there in the word mat? So it's at. That's 3 sounds. Okay, let's do another one. It gets harder, or this next one is harder. The next one is they. How many sounds are there in they? It's actually 2 sounds, V and A. It might be 4 letters, but it's only 2 sounds, V, A. Home. How many sounds is that? It's 3. O, So 3 sounds. O, Stack. 4. S, t, a, k. Stack. Spend. S, p, e, n, d. That one's 5 sounds. Now here's a crazy one. Fox. Fox is actually 4 sounds. F, a, k, s. Because that S is actually the only single letter in English that has 2 sounds. So that X actually has the K sound and then the S sound. So those are 2 different sounds. So fox actually has 4 sounds. F, a, k, s. Okay. If you guys have any questions, just let me know. You can interrupt anytime. What are all the ways you know to spell the long A sound? So I'm going to give you a second here to think about all the ways you know to spell the long A sound, or at least all the let's do the more common ones. Write them down if you happen to have a piece of paper or something handy. Otherwise, just say them out loud to yourself. This is super important for kids to know when they're spelling words. So kids who are really struggling with spelling benefit a lot from this kind of practice of, well, what are all the ways you know to spell the long A sound? What are all the ways you know to spell all the other long vowel sounds. What are all the ways you know to spell ow, or aw, or oi? Okay, so all the ways you know to spell the long A sound. Let's just do the more common ones. So one of them, so the most common one is a magic E, like lake or name. Some people call that a silent E. Some people call that a consonant E. So it goes by a couple different names. But that's the most common way to spell the long A sound. If you've got an A at the end of a syllable in a multisyllabic word, it's just going to be the A, like bagel or bakery. So just the long A. So we've got two now so far. If you've got an A sound at the end of a word, it's probably going to be a Y, like play or day or say. If you've got an AI in the middle of a word, it may well be the AI, like plain or main, like the main idea. Another one is great. So the EA, sometimes, not that often, but sometimes the EA makes that long A sound. So we actually have, there's a chart that you can help children create that has them write down as they're learning these things, all the different ways to know that they know to spell these different sounds, so that when they then go and write a word and they're not sure how to write it, they can sort of think through in their minds, okay, well, it's a long A sound, so my options are this, this, and this. This one only appears at the end of a word, or this one only appears in the middle of a word, and so by process of elimination, they can kind of narrow it down. Okay, so much for the warm-up. I'm moving on. Here we go. Okay, so the size of the reading problem. The size of the reading problem is enormous in this country. If you're on this call, chances are that you know somebody who is having a hard time with reading. There are a lot of kids and a lot of adults who are having a hard time with reading. According to the latest version of the nation's report card, which just came out within the past few weeks, only 31% of fourth graders can read at a fourth grade level. That means 69% of kids cannot read at 69% of fourth graders cannot read at a fourth grade level. So this problem is enormous, absolutely enormous. You and your children are not alone in this boat. What is dyslexia? So I pulled this from the website of the International Dyslexia Association. It basically says it's a specific learning disability. It is neurobiological in origin, characterized by difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition, poor spelling, poor decoding abilities. I underlined this piece. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language, and it's often unexpected in relation to cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So I'm just going to paraphrase that now because that is a mouthful. But basically what that's saying is that kids are having unexpected trouble learning to read, and I'm going to put a comma in here, usually the result of a problem with phonological processing. And we're going to talk a whole lot about that phonological piece later on today, because it is so important. For most kids, that phonological piece is the reason that they're struggling so much with reading and spelling. There's a note here at the bottom. There are changes in the works or there's a movement afoot to change this definition, because this makes it sound like phonological skills are the only thing that matters. That's not true. They are very, very important, but they're not the only thing that matters. I mean, there are other things like working memory and processing speed and all kinds of other things that also play into children's ability to learn to read or how quickly they pick up reading. There's a movement afoot to change this definition, but this is what we have right now. Okay. There is, I changed the order of these slides, sorry. So we'll talk for a sec about phonological skills, because that's not nearly as well known. Like, not everybody knows what in the world phonological skills are. So I thought I would just take a minute and try to explain that a little bit. Phonological skills, it's basically about how your brain is wired. And does your brain really, truly, deeply understand that words are made up of individual sounds. And if you string sounds together in different combinations, you get different words. To somebody who's a fluent reader and a good speller, it's like, yeah, of course, words are sounds and sounds are words, yeah. To somebody whose brain is not wired that way, that is not at all obvious. And if you don't understand that, the phonics that your teacher is trying to teach you doesn't stick very well because your brain doesn't really know what to do with this information. So for example, if your teacher is standing in front of the classroom and telling you that AI makes A, or is pronounced A, if you don't realize that you can put an N in front and an L at the end, or the N sound in front and the O sound at the end, and then string that all together and get nail, if you don't realize that, why is she standing up there in front of the classroom telling me that AI makes A? And maybe they can memorize it, but then they still don't actually, they don't have the ability to apply that. So if you've got weak phonological skills, it makes this job of learning all of our phonics patterns in English really, really hard. There are two really good programs out there for teaching kids phonological skills. More and more schools are now using the Hegarty program for whole class instruction. It's great. When you're doing one-on-one remediation, which is what we do at Kids Up Reading Coaches, we use the other program, we use Kilpatrick because that is better. It's easier for one-on-one remediation because you can really focus on the one skill that the student is working on. So you do this skill until they've mastered it, and then you do the next skill until they've mastered it, and so on and so forth, and it takes you through like 25 different levels. So for one-on-one work, I find Kilpatrick a whole lot better and easier to use. For a whole classroom, Hegarty's probably the way to go. Something interesting, this phonological training that I'm talking about, whether you're doing it through Hegarty or the Kilpatrick program, it literally rewires kids' brains. So they've done studies. You can tell that a 4-year-old, if you do these brain scans, you can see that a 4-year-old has dyslexia before you've ever tried to teach them to read. You can look at the size and the shape and the connections between the different parts of the brain. If you then do these exercises with them, it literally rewires their brain, and most of those differences go away. Not all of them, but most of them. I'll pause here for a sec. Does anybody want to jump in and ask any questions about this? Because I know this is not something that's well known. No? Okay. So then
I have a question.
Yeah.
Um, so my son has dyslexia and he is seeing a coach. Have you heard of a coach? They're a certified academic language therapist.
Yeah, I mean there are different programs that people use to learn to teach how to teach a dyslexic child to read. And yes, I have heard of that one. But unfortunately, if you're going to ask me now whether they have a good phonological program, I don't know. So all of
Okay.
the programs have a really good, well, I shouldn't say that. I'm pretty sure because I've heard of them, I'm pretty sure that they have a good phonics program. I don't know whether they have a good phonological program. You can ask. Why don't you just ask them next time your child is working with a tutor? Ask them what they're doing for the phonological program. And if they say we're doing the Hegarty program or we're doing the Kilpatrick program, you're golden, you're good. If they
Okay.
say, oh, we're doing a little of this and a little of that and something here and something there, and it's kind of, homegrown, whatever, I would be wondering. And then the question is, how quickly is your child progressing? If they're progressing at a good clip, it's fine, and the phonological piece that they're doing is probably fine. But if they're progressing really slowly, there's a good chance that there's not that the tutor isn't using a good phonological program. Because
Okay.
the studies are showing, and well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So somebody else just joined. Welcome. You're welcome to interrupt, ask questions anytime. I'm just going to keep going, but we can always backtrack if you have a particular question on something we've already covered. So I'll keep going here. This is the International Dyslexia Association's definition of dysgraphia. So dyslexia people usually use to refer to trouble with reading, and dysgraphia people usually use to refer to trouble with writing. Um, the definition is a little more, people use dysgraphia in multiple different ways. With dyslexia, it's pretty clear what people mean when they say dyslexia. With dysgraphia, it's a little bit less clear, because there are multiple reasons why a child might be, or somebody might be having trouble with writing. One possibility is that they're having trouble with handwriting, and maybe they've got, a poor pencil grip. Or maybe their hand cramps up because they're holding the utensil incorrectly, and so their hand really hurts. Or maybe, it's shaky, and therefore the handwriting, the lines are wavy and shaky. Those are all handwriting issues, and those could all be considered dysgraphia. That kind of dysgraphia is not related to the kind of dyslexia, or to dyslexia, which is what we were just talking about. There's another version, if you will, of dysgraphia that is related to dyslexia. It's basically the flip side of the coin. It's the spelling issue. And that is, do you have good phonological skills? Do you have good phonics skills? You need those in order to be able to read. The other side of the coin is you need those in order to be able to spell. So kids who are struggling with reading always also have trouble with spelling. Occasionally we see a student who has trouble with spelling, but not with reading. So that does happen occasionally. Not very often. Most often these things go hand in hand. If you're having a hard time with reading, you're going to have a hard time with spelling. Some kids also have this handwriting problem. But if your child just has a pure handwriting problem and it's not a spelling problem, then you probably want to be talking to an occupational therapist. They're the ones who would help your child develop the proper pencil grip and figure out why it's hurting or why the lines aren't straight or something like that. So that's not something that a dyslexia tutor would work on. For that, you would go to an occupational therapist. But if your child is not reading well or not spelling well, one or both of those, then you would be looking for somebody who helps kids learn the phonological piece and the phonics piece. And there are other components of reading as well, and we can get into those. But the phonological piece and the phonics piece are the two big ones, together with fluency, for helping kids develop those foundational reading skills of getting the words off the page, like literally being able to look at those letters and know what they say. We call that decoding. And encoding is what we call putting the words back on the page, so spelling. So decoding is reading, and encoding is spelling. Okay, I will stop briefly. Any questions? Anything?
I have a question. So what would it be when you're still flipping your B's and your D's and even numbers? What is that an indicator of,
Yeah, so
other
that's
than
interesting.
rushing?
What grade is the student in?
Second and third.
Second and third grade. Yeah, by now that should have sorted itself out. So people used to think that flipping B's and D's was a sign of dyslexia and that dyslexia was a problem with your visual system. And the research has figured out, no, dyslexia has nothing to do with your visual system. I mean, yes, there are people who have dyslexia who also have visual problems, but vision is not related to dyslexia. What's going on there is that these kids, because they're having a hard time with the reading and the spelling, they're probably getting less practice with it than other kids. And because they're getting less practice with it, they're still flipping these things. So for example, if you were going to go learn a new language in a new writing system, and there were 4 letters that all had a stick and a ball. And sometimes the stick was top left, and sometimes it's top right, and sometimes it's bottom left, and sometimes it's bottom right. And each of those is a different letter and a different sound. It would take you a while and quite a bit of practice to figure that out. And so that's what's going on with these kids who've got dyslexia and dysgraphia. They're not getting enough practice for them. Maybe it's because they're avoiding the task. Maybe they aren't even avoiding the task. Maybe it's just that they need more practice in order to get solid with the B and the D and the P and the Q. So that's what that is. So yes, it is considered a red flag for dyslexia, But again, not because it's a problem with the visual system. It's just this is
Hmm.
one of the things that happens if you've got dyslexia and dysgraphia.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay, then I will move on. And guess what? Some red flags for dyslexia, dysgraphia. So that was the perfect segue. So the one you just mentioned is here, down here at the bottom, the BD and other reversals past first grade. Like in first grade, it's totally normal for kids to be reversing the B and the D. But by second grade, third grade, they should have figured it out. So I'll go back to the top of the list. History of speech issues. This is a big one. There is a huge overlap between kids who have a history of speech problems and kids who are later flagged or identified with dyslexia and dysgraphia. And those speech issues can be delayed talking. They can be difficulty pronouncing certain letters. It can be difficulties with receptive and expressive language. I mean, there are lots of things that you would go see a speech language pathologist or a speech language therapist for, that you would work on, or your child would work on with that SLP or with the SLT. There's a big overlap between that population of kids and the population of kids who will later, because most of the speech, or a lot of the speech stuff happens in the earlier years. So there's a lot of overlap between the kids who see an SLP and the kids who need additional help in reading and spelling. So that's a big, something to watch out for, red flag if you want. Next one is trouble rhyming. For some kids, rhyming comes easily and naturally. For other kids, they don't understand how this works. And again, it goes back to this phonological issue that we were talking about before. In order to be able to rhyme, you have to be able to take the word apart. You have to realize that, okay, wait a minute, there's a begin. So let's say bat, for example. If you take the word bat and you want to find words that rhyme with bat, you have to be able to, in your mind, remove the b. So now you've got a b and an at. I'll do it like this, b, at. In order to rhyme, that at is going to stay the same, but you're going to swap out that beginning sound, bat, mat, cat, fat, sat, rat, and so on and so forth. So in order to be able to rhyme, you have to have the phonological skills that allow you to take this word bat apart, break it into onset, the first sound, and then the rhyme, which is the vowel and everything after it. So first you have to be able to break it apart. We call it segmenting. And then you have to be able to swap one of these pieces out. So when kids can't do that, that's considered another flag that they're going to have trouble with reading and spelling. Another one, if they're memorizing words rather than sounding them out when they're reading. I mean, there are certain words that, we call them red words. The kids more or less have to memorize, but we can have that conversation later. But for the most part, they should be starting at the left, figuring out the sound of the first letter or letters, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, and stringing it all together. That's what they should be doing when they encounter a word that they've never seen before. If instead what they're doing is they look at the first letter or two and then they just kind of guess, or maybe they just guess without even bothering too much with the first letter or two, that's a red flag. That means they haven't really understood that the way our system works is you start at the left and you work your way across to the right, you figure out all those sounds and you string them all together. Again, this is this phonological problem. Next one, if you have a child who writes was as saw, or anything like that. So you've got the right letters, but you've got them in the wrong order. Like I've literally had conversations with a kid who wrote was, or I asked them to write was and they wrote saw, or vice versa. And then I'm explaining to them that no, that's actually not right. And they will literally look at you and say, what do you want? I knew it was 3 letters. I knew what the 3 letters were. Who cares what order they're in? Again, it's this phonological problem. They don't understand that, no, actually the order makes a huge difference, and you need to know that order in order to be able to spell properly. Skipping sounds when spelling words. This happens a lot. Happens a lot with longer words, but even when the shorter words, it happens a lot, for example, with blends. So blends are 2 consonants that each retain their own sounds. So like slip has an L blend. or you can consider that an S blend. So we've got S blends, L blends, and R blends. Those are the most common beginning blends, and then we also have ending blends. A lot of times what happens with blends is that kids who are struggling will only really notice, focus on, pay attention to the first sound in that beginning blend. So a kid might write slip as sip and not have any idea, like even when you ask them to go back and look at it again, not have any idea why that's wrong, because they're not focusing on, I don't want to say not hearing, it's not that there's anything actually wrong with their hearing. Again, it's this phonological piece. And then the BD reversals, BD and other reversals we already talked about. So those are some red flags. Anything there anybody wants to talk about? Okay, then we'll move on. The good news is this is almost always solvable. A lot of parents, when I first talk to them, are really worried about their children. They're really worried, like, is my child ever going to be able to, and then you can fill in the rest of the sentence and you can just hear the stress and the worry. Totally understandable. I think it hasn't really gotten out there enough that in the vast majority of cases, yes, these kids can learn to read, and yes, they can catch up to their peers. Not everybody. I mean, we're working with about 50 kids right now. If I, think back to the maybe 200 or so kids we've worked with in the past few years, I could probably name for you most of the kids who we weren't able to get caught up to their peers. So they can read now, but they're not doing it as well or as fluently, and spelling might still be a real struggle. The rest of the kids we work with can get caught up to their peers, absolutely. So this was just one example. We don't get a whole, this is a pretty picture that, one of our families gave us from the school report. We don't get a whole lot of these pretty pictures. So whenever I get one, I hold on to it. So this one was from winter 23 to spring 23. So you can see how much improvement it is possible to make in just a matter of a few months. So this child is not yet caught up, but this trajectory continued. So it is absolutely possible to get the vast majority of these kids caught up to their peers. Okay, now we go on to the how, and we touched on this a little bit before. The Council for Exceptional Children actually very clearly says the current state of the evidence shows that OG, or Orton-Gillingham, which is a great way of teaching kids phonics, is not enough. Here, it actually says down here, findings suggested OG reading interventions do not statistically significantly improve foundational skill outcomes. It's not enough. What you actually need is not just this Orton-Gillingham phonics piece, you also need that phonological piece. So I don't mean to bash Orton-Gillingham. It is great for phonics. It's just not enough. You need the phonics piece and you need the phonological piece. And if you want to, you can just go into Google Scholar and just Google, how effective is Orton-Gillingham good for helping a dyslexic kid learn to read? And you will find more studies like this. I just put one up there. Okay, so I don't want to beat this horse to death, but it really is so important. Orton-Gillingham isn't enough. The phonics instruction isn't enough. In order for the phonics to stick, kids need really good phonological training. And if you've had your child evaluated by a psychologist, whether a school psychologist or a private psychologist outside of school, they will have tested your child's phonological skills. Go back and take a look at that report. Sometimes the report will say, oh, well, their phonological skills are in the average range, so the phonological piece isn't a problem. That's actually not right in my experience. The word average on the testing that psychologists do, it has a very, very broad meaning. So average is not, they don't mean like between the 40th percentile and the 60th percentile. That's maybe what I would consider average. Their numbers, their range is much, much, much bigger. So you can get a child who's in a much lower percentile compared to their peers, and that report might still show that they have average phonological skills. Maybe it's called low average phonological skills. If your student is struggling with reading and spelling and they've got, weak phonological skills, absolutely you need this. If they've got average phonological skills, you also need this, or they also need this phonological training. They're already struggling with reading and spelling. This phonological piece is going to make learning to read and spell easier. So even if they already have phonological skills, don't consider that good enough. You want them to have strong phonological skills. So you want to make sure they're getting this phonological training, whether it's in school or with a private tutor or however you're trying to tackle this problem. Orton Gillingham, so Orton Gillingham, the institute, like where I got my Orton Gillingham training, for example, they've all seen this. They all know that OG isn't enough. And so they're all changing their curriculum, and they're all now teaching the new people who go through their program these phonological skills. And so the place where I did my training, they have since then started training people in the Kilpatrick exercises, but that just started a couple years ago. And anybody who was OG trained by that organization more than a couple of years ago didn't get that good phonological training. Okay, any questions? Any questions so far? Okay, so now we get to the now what. Okay, so you've got a problem, or your child's got a problem. Now what are you supposed to do about it? What can you do about it? You have the right under law to have your student tested for dyslexia and dysgraphia by your public school. And if your child is not in the local public school, you can still take them to your local public school, and your public school still has to test them for dyslexia and dysgraphia. Schools are not always eager to do this testing, I will say. Once they've tested a student for dyslexia and dysgraphia, and they have found that these disabilities, as they call them, exist, then they're legally required to try to do something about it. And schools are all strapped for teachers, they're strapped for money, they're strapped for resources. So they don't really have a huge incentive to add a whole lot more kids to the caseload of their special ed team. So if you have not yet gotten the diagnosis and you want the diagnosis, the thing to do is give it to them in writing. If you just go to them and say, I want you to test my kid for dyslexia and dysgraphia, or they might call it learning disabilities in the area of reading and writing. It's the same thing as dyslexia and dysgraphia. If you just go and say that to them orally, you might in some schools get, oh yeah, okay, we're going to look at this and we're going to look at that and we're going to try this intervention first and then we'll do something else, and yeah, we'll eventually test your child if we decide that that makes sense, in a couple months. If you give it to them in writing, the legal clock starts ticking, and they have, I think it's 45 days to test your student. So give it to them in writing. That gets things moving much more quickly. Once you have the diagnosis, your student has the right to an IEP and has the right to get services from the school special education team. You can then negotiate with them. So when you're putting together the IEP, you would be negotiating with them how many minutes per week is your student going to get. I would say 30 minutes 2 or 3 times a week is probably pretty typical. And you'll also be negotiating with them, hopefully, maybe, what skills your student will be taught. But here's the thing. 30 minutes 2 or 3 times a week is not nearly enough to get a student caught up to their peers in reading and spelling. It's not enough. It just isn't. And the 30 minutes isn't even 30 minutes because it usually includes time to walk to the special ed teacher's classroom and walk back. And oh, somebody needs a bathroom break. And oh, by the way, they have to do progress monitoring. And oh, Tuesday we're going on a field trip. Let's put it this way. So if you're having this conversation with your school's special ed team, ask them how often they get kids caught up in reading and spelling and graduate them out of special ed because they taught them to read and spell and got them caught up. it doesn't happen much. But ask them and see what they say. Your other option is to do it privately through a place like us. And this is not supposed to be a presentation about our services, so I'm just going to do this very quickly. But we help kids get caught up to their peers in months, not years, for the most part, with one-on-one instruction, which is considered the gold standard for teaching kids to read. It has to be evidence-based, so following the science of reading, which means you're going to have the phonological piece and the phonics component. High intensity instruction, twice a week isn't going to cut it for most kids. They need 3 or 4 times a week. We actually work with kids, most kids 3 times a week, sometimes 4. Over the summer, it's often 5 times a week to get them caught up. You want the instruction tailored to your students' needs. If they're doing it in school, they will likely be doing small group instruction, and the teacher has to accommodate the needs of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, who knows how many kids. And so your student isn't getting exactly what they need. We can do different session lengths to get weekly progress updates, and we do it all over Zoom because most families find that they can't do 3 or 4 sessions per week and fit that into their schedules, with driving their child to a tutoring center or, having a tutor come to their house while they're making dinner and getting other kids ready for bed. Like, that just doesn't work for the most part. So we do everything over Zoom. Okay, and if you're worried about Zoom, we have a guarantee. Try it for a week, love it, or it's on us. We can talk about that if you want to care, but I'm going to move on. Another question I get sometimes is, can you prevent dyslexia? So here's the thing. If you've got an older student or an older sibling you already know is having trouble with reading and spelling, the younger siblings are automatically considered at risk because this runs in families. Not every student, absolutely not. But we work with a lot of sibling pairs. It happens very often that if one sibling is having trouble, another sibling is having trouble as well. So if you've got little ones at home, there are things you can do to improve their phonological skills before they even get to school. So you can be doing this with kids when they're 4 years old, when they're 5 years old, even once they've entered school. But if you can do this with a little kindergartner or 4-year-old, this is really going to go a long way towards solving these phonological problems before they ever become problems. So the first thing on the list here is nursery rhymes. So this is all about rhyming, like anything you can do to teach your child the rhyming, how rhyming works. And, nursery rhymes have actually been, there's evidence out there that reading nursery rhymes over and over and over again is actually really, really good for kids. So if they want you to read it to them for the 1000th time, go for it, do it. It's a great thing. It helps them understand how rhyming works. Miss Bindergarten goes to kindergarten. That actually goes with the next bullet point. So another thing that you can do to help kids understand that words are made up of individual sounds, and if you string sounds together in different combinations, you get different words, is you can ask them to tell you, well, what's the first letter, or I'm sorry, what's the first sound in that word that you just said? So let's say ball. What's the first sound your mouth makes as you're saying the word ball? And I said it that way, so it's not necessarily, it is, but we don't describe it as what's the first sound you hear when you say ball, because we actually want to draw kids' attention to the fact that their mouth is producing all of these sounds. So you might ask them, say ball, but after that very first piece, stop, cover your mouth, stop. So start to say the word ball, and you might go b, and then stop. And that helps them figure out, oh, okay, so ball starts with b. And obviously you do this with lots of different words and lots of different beginning sounds. And that's where books like Miss Bindergarten Goes to Kindergarten, that's where those books can help, because they are designed specifically to swap out those beginning sounds to help kids understand, oh, you can take away that first sound in a word. The word isn't like a unit. Like dyslexic kids will think a word is a unit. So this is a word, and 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 I have to memorize all of these words. And they they tend to get overwhelmed because they're looking around the classroom thinking, well, all these other kids are memorizing all these words. My memory isn't that good. I can't memorize all those words. They don't understand they're not supposed to memorize all those words. They're supposed to figure out the individual sounds and string them together. But in order to be able to do that, they have to realize that, well, there's a beginning sound and a middle sound and an ending sound in a word that has 3 sounds. So give me all the words you can think of that start with B. Ball, bat, baseball, whatever else you can think of. All the words you can think of that start with T or O or S. Once they've mastered that, do the same thing with the ending sound. Bat, what's the last sound that your mouth makes or that you make as you're saying the word bat? And you can emphasize that last sound, bat, to get them to focus on, oh, okay, well, the last sound in the word is a T. And they might know that that is the letter T. But again, if you're doing this with a 4-year-old, they might not know that that's a letter T. And then there's a Post-it game that I really love, and I think I'm actually gonna try to do this very quickly because this one's super fun. Can you guys see my desk and my hand on my desk?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So grab 2 stacks of Post-its in 2 different colors, ideally. We use one color for the consonants. You can't see that very well. Let me try to zoom in. Okay, hopefully that gets a little bit better, but that's an S. So there's one color of Post-it for the consonants and a different color of Post-it for the vowels. Okay, now you can see it better. And I'm going to have you're going to give your students a stack of, or a bunch of different consonants. And you're going to start with whichever consonants they know. If the only consonants they know are L and P, fine. Then start with the L and the P. And then you're going to have Post-its with a bunch of vowels. Again, start with whichever ones they know. So in this case, I've now got an L and a P for the consonants, and for the vowels, I've got an A and an E and an I. And then you might ask them to use these to write the word lip. So one thing you're doing here is you're taking away the hard work of actually writing these letters down. So if you've got a student who's got, pencil grip issues or who doesn't know how to form their letters, you can do this phonological work like this without them having to do that handwriting piece of it. So for lip, you would then say to them, okay, so what's the first sound? So say the word lip, say it slowly, maybe stretch it out. Lip. Which of these would you use for that old sound at the beginning? And they should be coming up with this L. So the L would go in the first position. And then that next sound, lip. What's the second sound? Oh, that's an I. And then what's that last sound? Oh, well, that's this P. And so now you have L-I-P that your student wrote with Post-its. And now you can do an exercise, a Post-it game is what I call it, where you're swapping these things out. And you're swapping them out and you're helping them learn the phonics skills. So you're helping them learn what sounds correspond with what letters. And you're also working on the phonological skills at the same time. So you might say to them, for example, and you always want to start with the first pile, because kids developmentally are able to manipulate the first sound in a word before they can manipulate the later parts of the word. So this is lip. So if you wanted to change lip to sip, how would you do that? And see if they can do it and see what they come up with. What you want them to do, of course, is take away the L, and put in the S. If that's not making sense to them, then you have to go through and explain it to them. So lip is ip, and then sip is sip. So which part of that had to change? So you can change sip, and then you can say, okay, now instead of sip, I want tip. And then they would put in the T right here. And instead of tip, now I want mip. So you can use real words and nonsense words. They don't have to all be real words. Once they can do that with the first sound, then have them do it with the last sound in the word. So this is mip. Now, how about mill? So for purposes of this, you're not worrying about spelling. I know that mill is spelled with 2 L's. We're not going to worry about that at this stage of the game. So this is mill, okay? Can you change mill and make it miss? And you want them to take away the L and put in the S. Once they can do that with a third pile, so they can separate out now the ending of the word, then developmentally, the last piece to fall into place is what happens here in the middle. So then you can go, so let's say we've got MIP here. Let's say we got MIP, and now you ask them, can you change MIP to map? And they should be able to swap this out. You can also start saying, okay, well, map, how about, can you change map to maps? And then let me adjust my camera here, but now I'm putting an S on the end, and they should be able to do this and say maps. Okay, well, what if instead of maps, what if I want SMAP? And you could have them put an S up here. So you can also have them add letters, not just swap out. It doesn't have to be 3 piles. You want to start with consonant, vowel, consonant, but then you can also start adding additional consonants, and you can get to the blends, beginning and ending blend. There we go. The last page has information on how to contact me. So you're welcome to contact me. There is you can send me an email. Here is my email address. It's a little tricky because my name is spelled, as Carmen and I were talking about before, my name is spelled with 1 L, not with 2s, and not with 2 L's. So it can get a little bit tricky, but if that's tricky, you can also go to our website. You can go to kidsupreadingcoaches.com, and you'll find a couple buttons on there. One of them says schedule a call. And that will take you, you have to answer a couple, like 2 or 3 basic demographic questions, like your name and whatever. And then it takes you to my calendar, and you can actually schedule a meeting with me right on my calendar. Or there's another button that says contact me. And then that ends up in my email inbox. You can also, I think there's a way of doing this through LinkedIn, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure. But there is information about us on LinkedIn. Yeah, so reach out anytime. I am happy to answer any questions.